I can say it's unacceptable, but unacceptable just doesn't capture the seriousness of this issue. So I think perhaps the best way that I can put it is, in my opinion, this really has to be the government's main priority to get this resolved.
Main priorities, some strong language there from Auditor General Michael Ferguson. That was on Tuesday, talking about the Phoenix pay system that's left government workers overpaid, underpaid, not paid at all. The price tag for fixing it likely going to blow past the government's projection of about $500 million and land closer to double that, $1 billion. So who better to weigh in on all this and much more at issue, of course. Andrew is in Toronto tonight, Chantal in Montreal, and Paul Wells is joining us from Ottawa. Good to see everybody. Andrew, at what point do the Liberals have to stop calling this a Conservative problem, and at what point do they start wearing it?
I don't know is the short answer. I'm sure there's shared blame here. There's no doubt this thing was pretty flawed from the beginning, but at some point the Liberals decided to flick the switch and go live with it. And look, at some point, for any government, your job is to fix the mistakes and messes left by previous governments. That's part of the definition of your role and responsibility. I do think, however, that the larger significance of this is less to do with one party or another, or one government or another, but systemic. It's, governments seem to have a lot of problem with IT projects to begin with, whether you're talking about the Canada.ca, or the Long Gun Registry, or the Ontario eHealth. And if you look at the long and the short of that is, governments are so enormous, they're so complex, there's so many collective bargaining agreements, so many unions, so many employers, so many work rules. It's gotten way too large for any human being, any human organization to manage in an efficient way.
Chantal.
It kind of makes you shudder at the mess that some provinces might make of the sale of cannabis when you think of the incapacity of governments to do basic things properly. Bottom line, though, unless this is fixed, the Liberals, whether that's fair or not, because they didn't start it, will end up wearing it in the next election, not because most Canadians are touched by this problem, but because it stands to become kind of a symbol of an incapacity to resolve issues, and there's very little that is more basic than getting people that work for you their paychecks.
Yeah, and I mean, we're on the third minister now to try and solve it, because Ralph Goodale had it for a period of time, and still no one's been fired, Paul. And that, to me, is like, I understand it's hard to fire unionized employees, but someone should take responsibility for it, and still that hasn't happened.
Yeah, I mean, if the Liberals are guilty of anything, it's a kind of extended bout of wishful thinking. The Auditor General chronicles a period, I mean, almost as soon as this government was elected, they were giving frequent briefings on the state of the Phoenix pay system, but it turns out they were essentially kidding themselves about the real scale of the problem. It was worse than they said. It was worse than they admitted to themselves. And it's going to take far more resources than they have admitted even to date. And meanwhile, every week, for dozens of kilometers in every direction outside of Ottawa, large portions of the population are either getting underpaid or they're getting overpaid and will be asked to pay the money, the extra money back. And so this thing grinds week after week. Most public servants that I talk to have had Phoenix pay problems.
Okay, I want to switch, if I can, to the housing announcement this week, because it was part of the election platform, so you would expect them to deliver. But there may be some issues there. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say.
We'll be working closely with the provinces and territories to make sure that affordable housing remains a key, achievable priority. To help them execute an ambitious housing agenda, we'll be investing nearly $20 billion in provincial and territorial housing programs over 12 years.
So the part that he's not mentioning there is that provinces have to pony up cash as well. Chantal, is this as significant as it seems if we don't know that provinces are going to do this or not?
Well, I think it's significant in the sense that it has been years, more than a decade, not just in social housing, but since the federal government has been upfront about a social measure of that magnitude. Whether it's going to work is very much an open question. They're going to have to negotiate this with people who may not be as friendly to them as the current provincial governments. Quebec has already said it wants a deal that respects its capacity to manage the file. There may be new governments in Ontario or Alberta or elsewhere who are going to say maybe that's not our priority or not the way we want to go.
Yeah, I wondered, Andrew, too, how much of this was a play to the progressive left that they courted throughout the election campaign. Like they had to do this because a lot of people inside the NDP and other sort of left-leaning parties, more left-leaning parties, would have said this is central to what you have to get done.
This is sort of a common theme with this government, isn't it? Is they sort of throw their hat over the wall and then they figure out later how they're going to retrieve it. It is a question in my mind, what exactly about housing it recommends itself to federal role in it, with the exception of the housing benefit, which is designed to be portable, and you want people to be able to move from province to province. But buildings themselves seems to be much more a local and provincial responsibility. And we've seen this movie before, where the feds get into these shared cost programs with the provinces, where they distort the provinces' priorities. They might have, as Chantal mentioned, other things they want to do with the same money, with equally pressing priorities. And you get into the same finger pointing and blurred accountability. You know, we really need to be going in the opposite direction, in my view, of having governments much more accountable to their own taxpayers for raising their own funds and spending their own funds, rather than these shared cost programs.
Yeah, Paul.
I don't want to be too down on this proposal. The devil's in the detail.
You're allowed to applaud it. You're allowed to applaud it.
We spent the first half of this panel talking about how often the devil is in the details. But if this thing were to work as the feds hope, it would be one of the best things that they've done. It's exceedingly rare that any government in the last 20 years has put a large amount of money into fixing the problems of the poorest Canadians. There's way too much preoccupation on the supposedly forgotten middle class. But when you help the poorest Canadians find housing, you have substantial public health benefits and substantial benefits on reducing crime over the long term. And so I think that's why a lot of big city mayors were very pleased to hear this, because they've been praying for an intervention on this scale for some time.
But Andrew's point is a good one, because I think, Paul, what you're saying about the mayors, they did want it. I've talked to Gregor Robertson about this, I don't know how many hundreds of times. So they did want it, but should they not be leading the charge rather than maybe just taking the money and walking off and figuring out how to solve it?
Right. I mean, there's a distinction between what's the role of government and what's the role of the federal government. There may well be a role for the government in these respects. As I say, I do want to say, I think the housing benefit, the portable, give cash to people, let them find their own housing with the federal cash, that's good, because that does involve a federal idea that you want people to be able to move from province to province. The rest of it, I'm not so sure.
And then there's the history of it, and it's also the history of Medicare. The federal government steps in and says, here, we've got these billions, come and join us. And then when finances get tight, and they might federally, they just pull out, which is how the federal government acted with social housing at the time of the Let's Balance the Books era under Jean Chrétien. So for
okay,
the
but
provinces,
if that was a bad thing for them to do, then we should be a little bit easier on them when they unpull out, which is what they've just done.
Yes, but if you force provinces to commit to a program and then you walk away, or you say, well, my share unilaterally, which is how they've acted with Medicare and how they acted with social housing, it doesn't make for provinces to say, let's buy into this great program that we will be left to sustain when they decide that they should balance their books.
Chantal gets the last word tonight. Thank you all. Appreciate it.